The engine compartment of the German destroyer Hermann Schumann vibrated with such violence that Kapitänleutnant Heinrich Wolff could feel his teeth chattering as he gripped the bridge rail, staring into the grey waters of Ofotfjord on the morning of April 10, 1940. The smell of diesel fuel mixed with the metallic tang of fear sweat as his crew prepared for what every man aboard knew was a suicide mission. Behind them, the port of Narvik burned with black smoke that blotted out the Norwegian dawn, while ahead lay the British destroyers that had already sent 3 German ships to the bottom of these icy waters. The orders from Berlin were clear: hold Narvik at all costs, maintain the iron ore shipments, and under no circumstances retreat from Norwegian soil. But as Wolff watched his fuel gauge drop toward empty and counted the dwindling shells in his magazine, he faced a choice that would define not just his own fate, but reveal the mathematical impossibility of Hitler's northern gamble. He was about to disobey direct orders from the Kriegsmarine High Command, and in doing so, expose the dark financial reality that would drain the Reich's treasury for the next 5 years. No one in the German High Command knew that one man's defiance that morning would illuminate the economic catastrophe of Operation Weserübung, the invasion that would cost Nazi Germany more than the conquest of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands combined. Heinrich Wolff had grown up in the small fishing village of Cuxhaven, where his father mended nets and his mother sold fish at the local market. The youngest of 4 sons, Heinrich had watched his older brothers leave for the Great War, and only one had returned, bearing shrapnel scars and stories of naval battles in the North Sea. The memory of his brother Otto's tales of British destroyers and torpedo runs had shaped young Heinrich's dreams, driving him to apply for the Naval Academy at Murvik, despite his family's modest means. His acceptance letter arrived on a grey November morning in 1924, and his mother wept as she read the official seal that would take her youngest son away to serve the new German Navy. At the academy, Heinrich excelled in navigation and tactical studies, but struggled with the rigid hierarchy that demanded unquestioning obedience to orders, regardless of changing battlefield conditions. His instructors noted in his file that Cadet Wolff possessed exceptional tactical instincts, but showed troubling tendencies toward independent thinking that could prove problematic in a disciplined naval service. After graduation, he served aboard cruisers in the Baltic, learning the intricate dance of naval warfare while watching Germany's military rebuild itself under the shadow of the Versailles Treaty. His first command came in 1938, when he was assigned to the destroyer Hermann Schumann, a sleek vessel armed with 5 4-inch guns and 8 torpedo tubes that represented the new German Navy's commitment to aggressive surface warfare. His crew initially doubted their young captain, who looked more like a university professor than a warrior, with his wire-rimmed glasses and habit of reading philosophy books during quiet watches. But Heinrich earned their respect during training exercises in the Baltic, where his unconventional tactics and willingness to bend regulations consistently outperformed larger, more experienced crews. By the winter of 1939, as war clouds gathered over Europe, his men would follow him into hell itself, though none of them suspected that hell would take the form of a frozen Norwegian fjord where mathematics and reality would collide in the most expensive naval campaign of the war. He had no idea that soon those instincts for independent thinking would be all that stood between his crew and annihilation, while simultaneously exposing the fundamental flaw in Nazi Germany's northern strategy. The invasion of Norway began as Adolf Hitler's response to British naval supremacy and Germany's desperate need for Swedish iron ore that traveled through Norwegian ports during the winter months when the Baltic Sea froze solid. By early 1940, German war planners had calculated that 65% of Sweden's iron ore exports to Germany passed through the Norwegian port of Narvik, making control of Norway's coastline a strategic necessity for continued military production. The broader context of the war had shifted dramatically since the invasion of Poland 6 months earlier, with both Britain and Germany recognizing that Scandinavia represented a crucial theater that could determine the outcome of the entire conflict. British planners had developed their own scheme to occupy Norwegian ports and cut off German access to Scandinavian resources, while simultaneously establishing northern bases for potential operations against the Soviet Union. The German response, Operation Weserübung, represented the most ambitious amphibious assault in military history up to that point, requiring coordination between the Army, Navy and Air Force across a front, stretching from Denmark to the Arctic Circle. The numbers alone revealed the operation's staggering scope. Over 100,000 German troops would be transported across the North Sea and Baltic Sea simultaneously, supported by nearly the entire German surface fleet and hundreds of transport aircraft. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel had calculated that success would require perfect timing, complete surprise and logistical support that pushed German capabilities to their absolute limit. The plan called for simultaneous assaults on 6 Norwegian cities, from Kristiansand in the south to Narvik in the far north, with each landing force required to capture and hold port facilities that could support ongoing operations. Intelligence reports indicated that Norwegian forces numbered only about 15,000 active soldiers, most equipped with obsolete weapons and lacking modern anti-aircraft defenses. However, the same reports noted that Norway's coastline stretched for over 16,000 miles, when including fjords and islands, creating defensive positions that would require enormous garrison forces to control effectively. German economists had produced studies showing that occupying Norway would cost approximately 2.5 million Reichsmarks per month in direct military expenses, not including the opportunity costs of deploying forces that could otherwise be used against France or Britain. The financial calculations behind Operation Weserübung revealed Hitler's fundamental misunderstanding of modern warfare economics, as German planners focused on immediate tactical gains while ignoring long-term strategic costs that would eventually cripple the Reich's ability to wage war on multiple fronts. The invasion began before dawn on April 9, 1940, with German forces achieving complete tactical surprise across all landing sites, but the early successes masked logistical problems that would plague the operation for its entire 5-year duration. At Narvik, the northernmost target, 10 German destroyers had transported nearly 2,000 mountain troops across 600 miles of open ocean, using fuel reserves that left them with barely enough petroleum to return to German ports. The mountain troops, equipped with specialized cold weather gear and trained for alpine warfare, quickly overwhelmed the small Norwegian garrison and captured the port facilities that controlled Sweden's iron ore exports. But the destruction of local infrastructure during the assault had damaged loading equipment and rail connections that would take months to repair, while British naval forces immediately began converging on the area to contest German control. By the morning of April 10th, as Heinrich Wulff's destroyer patrolled the approaches to Narvik, German forces controlled the port, but lacked the fuel, ammunition and supplies necessary to maintain their positions against inevitable British counterattacks. Radio intercepts had revealed that a British naval force, including the battleship Warspite and multiple destroyer squadrons, was approaching from the west, while Norwegian forces had begun organizing resistance operations in the surrounding mountains. The German High Command had calculated that Narvik could be captured with minimal casualties, but they had failed to account for the enormous ongoing costs of defending isolated positions against enemies who controlled the surrounding seas. Fuel supplies for the destroyers had been planned based on normal operational parameters, but the extended voyage to Narvik and subsequent patrol duties had consumed petroleum reserves at twice the anticipated rate. Ammunition expenditure had exceeded projections by 40% due to unexpected Norwegian resistance, while food and medical supplies remained aboard ships that were now trapped in hostile waters with insufficient fuel to retreat. The mathematics of the situation were becoming clear to commanders like Heinrich Wulff, who could see that German forces had achieved tactical success at the cost of strategic disaster. Heinrich stood on his bridge as the first British shells began falling around German positions in Narvik harbour, watching the complex tactical situation unfold while calculating fuel consumption rates and ammunition expenditures that told a story of impending catastrophe. His orders from Admiral Lutyens were explicit: maintain control of Narvik harbour at all costs, prevent British forces from disrupting iron ore shipments, and under no circumstances abandon Norwegian territorial waters without direct authorization from Berlin. The radio crackled with reports from other German destroyers in the fjord, each captain reporting critical fuel shortages and ammunition levels that would support perhaps one more engagement with British forces. Korvettenkapitan Max Eckart, aboard the Wolfgang Zenker, radioed that his ship had sufficient fuel for maybe 6 hours of combat operations, while his torpedo magazine contained only 4 remaining warheads after yesterday's engagement with British cruisers. The Bernd von Arnim reported engine problems that reduced maximum speed to 18 knots, making escape impossible if British forces achieved tactical surprise during the next engagement. Heinrich's own fuel situation was equally desperate, with enough diesel oil for perhaps 3 hours of high-speed maneuvering, while his gun crews had counted exactly 67 shells remaining in the forward magazines. The tactical mathematics were simple enough for any naval officer to understand. German forces lacked the resources to fight another major engagement, while British reinforcements were approaching with overwhelming numerical superiority. But the strategic implications went far beyond this single battle. As Heinrich began to comprehend the enormous financial burden that Operation Weserübung had placed on the German war machine, every destroyer trapped in Norwegian waters represented millions of Reichsmarks in construction costs, while trained crews and experienced officers were irreplaceable assets that Germany could not afford to lose in futile gestures. The iron ore that flowed through Narvik was certainly valuable, but Heinrich could calculate that the cost of defending the port would exceed the value of the resources it protected within a matter of months. His engineering background allowed him to estimate the ongoing logistical requirements for maintaining German forces in Norway. Fuel shipments across hostile seas, ammunition resupply through contested airspace, food and medical supplies for isolated garrisons, and replacement personnel for inevitable casualties. The numbers simply did not balance, revealing Operation Weserübung as a financial catastrophe disguised as military necessity. The morning of April 10th brought news that would force Heinrich to confront the impossible choice between military obedience and mathematical reality, as British naval forces approached Narvik with sufficient firepower to destroy every German vessel trapped in the fjord. Radio intercepts revealed that the British squadron included 8 destroyers led by the battleship Warspite, whose 15-inch guns could sink any German destroyer with a single direct hit. The tactical situation had become hopeless, but Adolf Hitler's personal order demanded that German forces fight to the last shell rather than surrender Norwegian territory to the British Empire. Heinrich gathered his senior officers in the chart room, where navigation charts showed the narrow fjords that trapped German destroyers like fish in a barrel, while fuel calculations demonstrated the impossibility of escape even if orders permitted retreat. Oberleutnant Klaus Fischer, his gunnery officer, reported that forward magazines contained exactly 67 shells, while the aft magazine held 31 rounds of varying caliber. Chief Engineer Wilhelm Braun estimated fuel reserves at 11% of capacity, sufficient for perhaps 2 hours of combat maneuvering before the engines would fall silent. Torpedo Officer Lieutenant Hans Weber counted 4 remaining torpedoes, all armed with warheads that could damage British destroyers, but would have minimal effect against the approaching battleship. The crew's morale remained high despite the desperate situation, as German sailors had been trained to follow orders regardless of personal consequences. But Heinrich could see the mathematical certainty of destruction written in the faces of his subordinates. His communications officer, Funkmat Erik Johansson, had intercepted British radio traffic, indicating that the Royal Navy intended to annihilate German forces in Narvik as an example to other nations considering alliance with Nazi Germany. The political implications were clear enough, but Heinrich's mind focused on the economic calculations that revealed Operation Weserübung as a strategic blunder that would drain German resources for years to come. Every ship lost in Norwegian waters represented industrial capacity that could not be replaced quickly enough to affect the war's outcome, while experienced crews required months of training that Germany could not afford during a global conflict. His decision to disobey orders was forming slowly in his mind, based not on cowardice or disloyalty, but on mathematical analysis that showed the futility of sacrificing irreplaceable assets for temporary tactical gains. At exactly 11:15 that morning, Heinrich Wolff made the unauthorized decision that would expose the fundamental flaw in Nazi Germany's Norwegian strategy, choosing to save his crew and ship rather than follow orders that demanded pointless sacrifice in an economically unsustainable campaign. He ordered his communications officer to send a coded message to the other German destroyers in the fjord, proposing a coordinated withdrawal that would preserve German naval assets for future operations where they might actually affect the war's outcome. The response was immediate and unanimous, as every German captain recognized the mathematical impossibility of their situation and chose survival over symbolic gestures. Heinrich's tactical plan involved using the morning fog and narrow fjord geography to mask German movements, while employing the remaining fuel reserves for a high-speed run to open water, where scattered destroyers might have a chance of reaching friendly ports. The operation required precise timing and considerable luck, but Heinrich calculated that even a 50% survival rate would preserve more German naval strength than fighting a hopeless battle against overwhelming British firepower. His crew responded to the withdrawal orders with professional efficiency, despite knowing that they were technically committing mutiny against direct commands from Berlin. Funkmaat Johansen began transmitting false radio reports to confuse British intelligence about German positions, while Engineer Braun coaxed maximum performance from engines that had been running continuously for over 36 hours. Gunnery Officer Fischer prepared his remaining shells for a fighting withdrawal, knowing that German destroyers would have to battle their way through British forces, regardless of Heinrich's tactical planning. The first explosions echoed across Narvik harbour at 11:47, as British shells began finding their range, but Heinrich's ships were already moving toward the fjord mouth in a desperate gamble to escape the trap that Operation Weserübung had created. What happened next would demonstrate both the courage of individual German sailors and the impossible financial burden that Norwegian operations would place on the Reich's war economy for the next 5 years. The breakout began as Heinrich's destroyer led the formation through the narrow channel leading from Narvik harbour toward the open sea, while British shells crashed into the water around them like thunderclaps from an angry god. The Hermann Schumann shuddered as near misses threw fountains of spray across her deck, but Heinrich maintained course and speed despite the obvious danger to his ship and crew. Behind him, the other German destroyers followed in line formation, their captains trusting Heinrich's navigation skills to guide them through waters that contained both British warships and unmarked minefields. The tactical situation required split-second decision-making as British destroyers moved to block the fjord mouth, while the battleship Warspite maneuvered to bring her massive guns to bear on the fleeing German vessels. Heinrich's unauthorized withdrawal had caught British commanders by surprise, as they had expected German forces to remain in defensive positions around Narvik harbour according to typical German tactical doctrine. The element of surprise gave Heinrich's formation perhaps 15 minutes before British forces could coordinate an effective response. But those 15 minutes required flawless navigation through some of the most dangerous waters in the world. Chief Engineer Braun reported that fuel consumption was exceeding all previous calculations as the engines operated at maximum power, while the ship's structure groaned under stresses that had never been tested during peacetime operations. Gunnery Officer Fischer opened fire as British destroyers moved to intercept, his carefully rationed shells finding their targets with accuracy that reflected months of training in Baltic waters. The Wolfgang Zenker took a direct hit from British naval gunfire, but continued maneuvering despite damage that would have crippled a lesser vessel, her crew demonstrating the professional competence that made German naval forces so respected throughout the world. Heinrich watched the fuel gauges drop toward empty while calculating distances to the nearest German port, realizing that his tactical gamble might save some ships while sacrificing others to the mathematical certainty of fuel exhaustion. The irony was becoming clear, even as shells exploded around them. German destroyers were burning petroleum reserves that cost more than the iron ore they had been sent to protect, while fighting British forces whose own logistical situation was equally precarious. The true cost of Operation Weserübung was being written in diesel fuel and ammunition expenditure that would total millions of Reichsmarks before the morning ended, revealing the economic madness of Hitler's northern strategy. As the German formation broke through the British encirclement, Heinrich calculated that 4 destroyers would probably reach Norwegian ports with skeleton crews and empty fuel tanks, while 3 others faced certain destruction from either British gunfire or mechanical failure caused by excessive engine strain. The mathematics of survival had replaced tactical doctrine as the determining factor in the engagement, with fuel consumption rates dictating maneuvers that would have been impossible under normal operational circumstances. The Bernd von Arnim dropped out of formation with engine failure, her crew preparing to scuttle rather than surrender to British forces, who showed no inclination toward accepting prisoners after the bitter fighting around Narvik. Heinrich's own ship was consuming fuel at nearly twice the normal rate due to maximum power settings, while vibrations from the overstressed engines threatened to shake the vessel apart before they could reach safety. British destroyers pursued the fleeing Germans with determination that reflected their own frustration at the unexpectedly fierce resistance encountered during what should have been a simple operation to recapture Norwegian territory. The tactical situation had devolved into a running gun battle that favored neither side, as British vessels faced the same logistical constraints that plagued their German opponents in waters far from friendly bases. Radio intercepts revealed that British commanders were reporting fuel shortages and ammunition expenditures that exceeded their operational budgets, while requesting reinforcements that Royal Navy planners could not provide without compromising other theatres. Heinrich began to understand that the Norwegian campaign was bankrupting both sides simultaneously, creating a strategic situation where tactical victories became Pyrrhic defeats measured in resource expenditure rather than territorial control. His unauthorized withdrawal had saved perhaps half of his formation while exposing the fundamental economic flaw in Operation Weserübung. The cost of maintaining naval forces in Norwegian waters exceeded any possible strategic benefit, regardless of which side achieved temporary tactical dominance. The fuel gauges on Heinrich's bridge showed critical levels as the German formation approached territorial waters where Luftwaffe aircraft might provide cover. But even survival would not change the mathematical reality that Nazi Germany lacked the economic resources to sustain Norwegian operations indefinitely. The aftermath of Heinrich's unauthorized withdrawal would ultimately vindicate his tactical decision while revealing the staggering financial burden that Operation Weserübung placed on the German war economy throughout the remainder of World War II. 3 German destroyers reached Trondheim with fuel tanks nearly empty and crews exhausted from 38 hours of continuous combat operations, while 4 others were lost to British action or mechanical failure during the withdrawal from Narvik. Heinrich's own ship limped into port with engine damage that would require 2 months of repair work, using materials that Germany could not easily replace during wartime conditions. The immediate tactical results appeared to favor the British Empire, which regained control of Narvik and interrupted iron ore shipments for several weeks. But the strategic implications told a different story that German economists would spend months calculating. Heinrich faced a formal court of inquiry for disobeying direct orders, but the charges were quietly dropped when higher authorities recognized that his actions had preserved more naval assets than rigid adherence to tactical doctrine would have achieved. Korvettenkapitän Eckart, who had followed Heinrich's lead during the withdrawal, submitted a detailed report documenting fuel consumption rates and ammunition expenditures that revealed the impossible logistics of maintaining German forces in Norwegian waters. The numbers were staggering. Each German destroyer operating in Norwegian waters consumed approximately 15,000 liters of diesel fuel per day, while ammunition costs averaged nearly 50,000 Reichsmarks per engagement with British forces. Medical expenses for wounded sailors, replacement costs for lost equipment, and overtime payments for extended operations pushed the daily operational cost for each destroyer to over 200,000 Reichsmarks, not including depreciation on ships that were being worn out faster than peacetime operations would suggest. Heinrich's engineering calculations showed that Operation Weserübung was costing the German treasury nearly 1 million Reichsmarks per day just for naval operations, while army garrison forces required additional millions for food, ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies. The iron ore flowing through Norwegian ports was certainly valuable to German industry, But Heinrich could demonstrate mathematically that the cost of protecting those shipments exceeded the value of the resources by a factor of nearly 3 to 1. Over the following months, Heinrich's tactical report became required reading for German naval planners who were struggling to understand why Operation Weserübung continued consuming resources without producing proportional strategic benefits. His detailed analysis of fuel consumption, ammunition expenditure, and maintenance costs provided the first comprehensive economic assessment of German operations in Norway, revealing that Hitler's northern strategy was draining the Reich's treasury faster than any other theatre except perhaps the Russian front. The report documented how Norwegian operations required continuous resupply across hostile seas, while British naval forces interdicted German shipping with increasing effectiveness as Royal Navy commanders learned to exploit the geographic disadvantages that trapped German forces in remote fjords. Heinrich calculated that maintaining 40,000 German troops in Norway cost approximately 60 million Reichsmarks per month, while the strategic benefits of controlling Scandinavian territory remained questionable given the enormous defensive requirements imposed by Norway's geographic characteristics. His mathematical analysis showed that every ton of Swedish iron ore delivered through Norwegian ports cost nearly twice as much to protect as the equivalent tonnage purchased from neutral countries, while tying up military resources that could have been deployed more effectively in other theatres. The economic data supported Heinrich's unauthorized tactical decision, demonstrating that preserving German naval assets produced better long-term strategic results than symbolic gestures that sacrificed irreplaceable resources for temporary psychological victories. Senior German naval officers began incorporating Heinrich's cost-benefit analysis into their operational planning, recognizing that modern warfare required economic thinking as much as traditional tactical doctrine. Admiral Dönitz himself reviewed the report and concluded that Operation Weserübung represented a strategic mistake that diverted resources from more productive campaigns, though political considerations prevented any public acknowledgement of the operation's economic failure. Heinrich received a quiet promotion to Fregattenkapitän and assignment to naval planning staff, where his analytical skills could contribute to more realistic assessments of German strategic capabilities. His experience in Norwegian waters had taught him that military success required mathematical precision as much as battlefield courage, while demonstrating the dangers of political decision-making that ignored economic realities. By 1943, German forces in Norway numbered over 300,000 troops, supported by extensive fortification systems that consumed materials and labor desperately needed for other military projects, validating Heinrich's early assessment that the Norwegian campaign would become a strategic liability rather than an asset. The Atlantic wall fortifications built along Norway's coastline required more concrete and steel than the entire Siegfried Line, while providing defensive value that military engineers privately acknowledged was largely symbolic given the impossibility of defending 16,000 miles of coastline against determined amphibious assault. Heinrich's cost analysis had predicted that Norwegian operations would eventually consume over 20% of Germany's military budget, and by the third year of occupation, his projections proved remarkably accurate, as Wehrmacht accountants struggled to fund operations across multiple theatres simultaneously. The garrison forces in Norway included some of Germany's best mountain divisions, whose specialized training and equipment could have been decisive in other campaigns, but remained tied down defending territory that produced minimal strategic benefit. Norwegian resistance operations, inspired partly by the fierce German resistance during the initial invasion, required continuous German response operations that further increased operational costs while accomplishing little beyond maintaining tenuous control over hostile territory. Heinrich's original report had noted that occupying hostile territory required approximately 5 times as many troops as conquering it, and German experiences in Norway confirmed this mathematical relationship with devastating accuracy. The economic burden of Operation Weserübung contributed significantly to Germany's decision to delay or cancel other military projects as resources allocated to Norwegian operations could not be used for tank production, aircraft manufacturing, or submarine construction that might have affected the war's outcome more decisively. Heinrich continued serving as a naval planner throughout the war, contributing to operational assessments that increasingly focused on economic sustainability rather than purely tactical considerations. His colleagues noted that his experiences in Norwegian waters had transformed him from a traditional naval officer into something approaching a military economist, whose analytical methods influenced German strategic planning during the war's later phases. The personal cost of Heinrich's unauthorized decision extended far beyond official recognition, as he carried the knowledge that his mathematical analysis had been correct while watching Germany pour resources into Norwegian operations that could never justify their enormous expense. Letters from his former crew members described their post-war careers and families, with many noting that Heinrich's tactical decision had given them opportunities for survival and normal lives that rigid adherence to orders would have denied. Oberleutnant Fischer became a mathematics teacher in post-war Germany, often telling his students about the naval officer who had used mathematical thinking to save lives during impossible circumstances. Chief Engineer Braun established a successful machine shop that employed several former crew members, creating civilian careers based on technical skills learned during wartime naval service. Funkmaat Johansen emigrated to America, where he worked for Boeing Aircraft and contributed to commercial aviation development that connected the world in ways unimaginable during the war. These men wrote letters expressing gratitude for Heinrich's decision to disobey orders, recognizing that their survival had depended on a captain who valued human life over political symbolism. Heinrich saved every letter in a wooden box that had belonged to his father, reading them occasionally when the weight of his wartime experiences threatened to overwhelm the quiet satisfaction of post-war civilian life. He never married, perhaps because his analytical mind could not reconcile the emotional demands of family life with memories of mathematical decisions made under impossible circumstances. His post-war career involved consulting work for German shipbuilding companies, where his expertise in operational cost analysis helped design vessels that balanced performance with economic efficiency. Colleagues noted that Heinrich possessed unusual insight into the relationship between tactical capabilities and strategic economics, though few understood the wartime experiences that had shaped his analytical methods. He remained proud of his unauthorized decision at Narvik, not because it had saved his own life, but because it had demonstrated the importance of mathematical thinking in military planning and the dangers of political decision-making that ignored economic realities. Heinrich Wolff died quietly in 1978, leaving behind technical papers that influenced German naval architecture for decades and a reputation among his colleagues as a thoughtful analyst who understood the economic dimensions of military conflict better than most professional soldiers. His obituary in the German Naval Journal noted his service during Operation Weserübung, without mentioning the unauthorized withdrawal that had saved lives, while exposing the operation's fundamental strategic flaws. The wooden box containing letters from his former crew members was donated to a military museum, where researchers discovered documentation supporting Heinrich's analysis of the Norwegian campaign's economic costs. Modern military historians studying Operation Weserübung have concluded that Heinrich's tactical decision represented sound strategic thinking disguised as battlefield improvisation, demonstrating how individual initiative could reveal systemic problems in high-level military planning. The Norwegian campaign ultimately cost Nazi Germany over 6 billion Reichsmarks during its 5-year duration, validating Heinrich's prediction that the operation would consume resources far exceeding any possible strategic benefit. His mathematical analysis had been correct from the beginning. Germany lacked the economic capacity to sustain Norwegian operations while fighting wars on multiple fronts, regardless of the operation's tactical successes or symbolic importance. The iron ore that flowed through Norwegian ports during German occupation never compensated for the enormous costs of defending those shipments against British interdiction, while garrison forces in Norway could have been deployed more effectively in other theatres, where they might have changed the war's outcome. Heinrich's unauthorized decision at Narvik had saved perhaps 200 German sailors while demonstrating the mathematical impossibility of Operation Weserübung, revealing how individual courage and analytical thinking could expose strategic folly disguised as military necessity. His legacy lived on in the technical reports that influenced post-war German naval planning, ensuring that future military leaders would consider economic sustainability alongside tactical doctrine when evaluating strategic options. The broader lesson of Heinrich Wolff's unauthorized withdrawal from Narvik transcends the specific circumstances of Operation Weserübung, demonstrating how mathematical analysis and individual courage can reveal the hidden costs of political decisions made without regard for economic reality. His story illuminates the relationship between tactical success and strategic failure, showing how military operations that achieve immediate objectives can become long-term disasters when measured against resource expenditure and opportunity costs. Modern military planners study Heinrich's cost analysis as an example of how economic thinking must inform strategic decision-making, particularly in conflicts where resource constraints determine ultimate outcomes more than battlefield victories. The Norwegian campaign represents one of history's clearest examples of how political symbolism can override mathematical reality in military planning, creating strategic burdens that persist long after initial tactical objectives have been achieved. Heinrich's willingness to disobey orders, when mathematical analysis indicated their futility, exemplifies the kind of independent thinking that democratic military institutions seek to encourage, while authoritarian systems often suppress in favor of unquestioning obedience to political authority. His legacy challenges modern military leaders to consider whether courage sometimes requires disobedience to orders that ignore mathematical realities, particularly when human lives depend on decisions made by leaders who may not understand the economic dimensions of military conflict. The questions raised by Heinrich's story remain relevant today, as military planners continue struggling to balance political objectives with resource constraints, in an era where economic factors often determine strategic outcomes more than battlefield prowess. Would you have made Heinrich's choice, disobeying direct orders to save resources and lives, when mathematical analysis revealed the futility of continued resistance? Comment below and share this story, so others remember that true military leadership sometimes requires the courage to question authority when mathematics reveals the impossibility of political demands.